Hi, and welcome to the State of 911 webinar series hosted by the National 911 Program. My name is Sherry, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This webinar series is designed to provide useful information for the 911 stakeholder community about federal and state participation in the planning, design, and implementation of next generation 911 or NG911 systems. It includes real experiences from leaders utilizing these processes throughout the country. Today's session will feature Laurie Flaherty of the National 911 Program, along with Ed Reuter, the Executive Director of the Indiana Statewide 911 Board, sharing with us how to plan, prepare for, and implement a federal grant. For closed captioning, please copy and paste the URL link in the chat window to an additional web browser. For more information on National 911 Program webinars, or to access archived recordings or learn more about the National 911 Program itself, please visit 911.gov. Feedback or questions about the webinar can be sent to national911team@missioncriticalpartners.com. The National 911 Program would also like to invite you to visit the 911 telecommunicator Tree of Life and share the name of a remarkable 911 telecommunicator who has inspired you. Share your story at 911treeoflife.org to honor a special 911 telecommunicator who is making a difference in your community. Please note that all participants' phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode, and this webinar is being recorded. To ask questions of our presenters, feel free to take one of two actions. Using GoToWebinar's question feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, enter your question at any time during the presentation, and it will be entered into a queue. This feature is not visible while your screen is in the expanded page view. Or if you'd like to ask your question live, use the raise hand feature to request your phone line be unmuted, and you will be called upon to ask your question. Individuals registered for this webinar today will receive access to today's PowerPoint presentation and the webinar recording after the webinar is concluded. So with that, normally this is the time when I would turn everything over to Laurie Flaherty and ask her to introduce our first speaker. However, since our first speaker is Laurie, and I believe she really doesn't need an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Sherry. As Sherry mentioned, I am the coordinator of the National 911 Program, and I'm very pleased to be spending a little bit of time with you today. If we could go to the next slide, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the 911 Program. If you're not familiar with it, Congress gave us 3 jobs. The first job is to convene stakeholders to act as sort of a coordinator to bring the community together to make decisions for itself and on how to take action. We also collect and create resources for the folks at the state and local level that actually operate the nation's 911 system. And we do administer a grant program specifically for the upgrade of 911 technologies and operations. We do that third job along with the folks at NTIA at the Department of Commerce. The other 2 jobs are largely carried out exclusively by those of us who are at the Department of Transportation, and frankly, a small army of folks who help us do that. That cover you see on the slide is our annual report. We're about to publish this year's, but if you're interested, the URL for that annual report that sort of lists all of our activities is on the bottom of the slide. Next slide. For the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to mention the role of the federal staff. So I know that there's a lot of information out there about what is currently being proposed in terms of the possible next round of grants for 911. As a federal employee, we are precluded from offering any opinions or ideas on that unless we are specifically requested to provide technical assistance by congressional staff. So for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be really focusing on really high level sort of ideas and suggestions. But if you're thinking about sort of how to prepare for grants, I think all of these apply regardless of whether you are at the state and local level, and they aren't specific to any particular language. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, I'd just like to mention, you know, if that legislation happens, just one thing about it. You know, if you have followed the news and the trade press and other sources on that, you know that what is being proposed is an awful lot of money. That to me means that we're getting one shot to implement NG911, and it would behoove us to get our ducks in a row going into that so that we can take full advantage of that opportunity. Next slide. We're going to be talking about a lot of different ideas, but one of the things that I wanted to mention is we just finished publishing a case study by the state of California that describes how they are moving forward with implementing their NG911 system. And there are three elements that Bud Courier, who is their state 911 administrator, talks about in that case study that he says made all the difference in terms of their implementation. Those three elements are effective planning, leadership, and communication. And it's really ideas like that I'm going to be focusing on today and sharing with you and inviting you to think about as you are thinking about, you know, the possibility of another round of grants. I know that a lot of you, you know, sort of are up to your, you know, proverbial eyeballs in what you are doing already. You know, I can totally understand if your reaction might be, oh dear God, I have more than I can handle right now. But again, you know, if we are to take full advantage of a huge one-time opportunity, I think some of these things are good things to start thinking about right now. You know, the basics, the who, the what, some ideas, you know, for if you are an early adopter, for those that are further behind or, you know, way behind, some considerations for you, and just some general considerations for thinking about the future. So with that, if you could move on to the next slide, I'm going to start with the who. I think it's important to understand whether you are part of a local 911 agency or a state 911 agency, who you are within your own organizational structure. You know, are you part of a state agency? Are you part of a local agency? What does that mean? What do you know about your local or state 911 organizational structure? How does it function? What processes does it use on a day-to-day basis to address issues? Who do you know within that organizational structure that might be helpful to you in learning more about it? Is your state one that has what I would refer to as a coordination body at the state level? Or is your state one that has formal authority? I'm not sure that it matters much which one you have in terms of, you know, trying to get involved and take action that would help you prepare. But it might be important to understand the difference because there are certainly functions that will occur within those two structures that are very different. Another thing to understand is what formal entities exist, you know, either at the local or state agency. Do you have a 911 board, for example? What kinds of committees does that board currently have? What kinds of issues are they addressing? You know, does your local or state agency have working groups that are collaborating on issues? I think that might be something really important to understand if you would like to get actively involved. I've already talked a little bit about what structure is being used, but the structure, the organizational structure of your state or local 911 agency may be slightly different than the structure that is being used to implement next generation 911. The NG911 implementation strategy may involve more people than your immediate organizational structure, and it might be important to understand what that looks like and who that includes. Probably most important, regardless of who you are, is how can you help? I mean, I will guarantee you that, you know, if there are committees or working groups that are part of your local or state agency or, you know, the 911 board, they would welcome some help. They would welcome your help in providing, you know, your ideas and your expertise. And while you might think that that is simply providing them with free labor, I will tell you that for a lot of people, that equates to free training. If you are interested in advancing your own career, I will repeat what I just said. Giving them free labor will be free training for you that may be useful to you in advancing your own career. And while you're doing that, you'll be establishing professional connections that will be invaluable to you regardless of what you decide to do with your own career. So the who is really important to understand. Next slide. I think the next idea is sort of the what. Starting out with understanding where your local or state jurisdiction is with NG911 implementation is important. So if you don't know where you are, it's a little hard to figure out where you need to go. One tool that may be really useful to you in figuring that out is the NG911 self-assessment tool. That tool was originally developed by the Task Force for Optimal PSAP Architecture, which was a formal advisory group to the FCC. The SAFECOM NICSWIC 911 working group then converted that 200-page report into an online tool that anyone can download and use to figure out exactly where you are in your deployment of NG911 and what needs to happen next. It's a pretty comprehensive, detailed tool. It's been downloaded a lot, but it is there for your use to figure out exactly where you are in that continuum. Also, it would be important to understand what your state and local 911 plan is for deployment. What does it look like? Who does it include? And then, you know, once you understand those two things, then the question becomes, what are the logical next steps to implement next generation 911? I think we tend to think about that in terms of what I refer to as the 4 basic building blocks of NG911, but frankly, there's a whole lot more to it. You know, those 4 basic building blocks are the ESINet, the core services, GIS, and CPE, or call handling equipment. I think we tend to think about implementing NG911 in terms of those 4 basic building blocks, but there's a whole lot more to it than that. And starting to think about those things may be important. Next question, how many fronts can you take on at one time? You know, there are things that need to happen to implement NG911 that sort of need to happen in a logical progression. There's probably more than one. How many of those can you pragmatically take on at one time? And which ones are your priority? You know, having those discussions now would be really useful to you so that you can hit the ground running when and if another round of grants occurs. And you know, sort of directly associated with that, what resources do you have to pull all this together? You know, how many people, what kind of you know, support in terms of funding might you or your state have to figure out exactly where you are and how you should move forward? And you know, for the NG911 plan, this last question is important. Who else needs to be at the table? And GIS is probably a good example. In many state and local jurisdictions, that involves people other than folks at the 911 agency. What other agencies have to be involved from a procurement standpoint? What other agencies might have to be involved from a grant management standpoint? And you know, even beyond that, what agencies might need to be involved if you're starting to think about interconnecting your 911 system with those of a federal agency, like the Department of Defense or the Park Service or the Coast Guard. All of these things are things that would be useful to you to understand and to figure out so that you not only know where you are, but where you go from there. Next slide. Once you know that, I mean, you know, so there might be a plan, but what's the plan for the plan? You know, what is the organizational structure that it will operate within? What is the process that that group will use to move the plan forward? What is your timeline? I mean, and this is just a what if in that next line. If the period of performance for the next round of grants is, say, 8 years, what's your plan for how to carry that out? I think scenarios are important, particularly in terms of timelines, to understand exactly what you might be capable of pulling off within that time frame. And as I mentioned previously, you know, understanding what kinds of resources are available will be important, not only in terms of funding and personnel, but also informational resources. You know, what can you learn from other states and other local governments? What kinds of resources and documents are available to you that could be used to help you formulate your plan? Next slide. If you're an early adopter, let's say you are, you know, either, you know, close to or done with putting those 4 basic building blocks in place, you're not done. I mean, you know that. So this is just a list of random ideas that you might consider for moving forward with that NG911 self-assessment tool, and, you know, the different steps to get you all the way to end state NG911. I mean, maybe you're at a point with your regional, with your local jurisdictions so that they can start thinking about a regional intrastate interconnection kind of project, particularly if you're home rule and everybody is doing their own thing, they have their own contracts, this may make a lot of sense. There are a lot of states that are currently working toward interstate interconnection. They're at a point with their own systems where they're starting to think about how they're going to transfer calls between states. And this interstate interconnection thing makes a lot of sense. We also have resources available to you on that. But the Interstate Playbook is on 911.gov, and that may be useful to you in that regard. We also are, you may also be thinking about the interconnection between NG911 and the public safety broadband network. We're currently working on a project with the 911 program that is really taking a close look at that. For those of you for whom it pertains, you may also be thinking about, you know, interconnection with the borders, you know, whether you're in the far north or the far south, that may be an issue for you that you may start to think about. And as I mentioned before, there are a half a dozen states that are already starting to think about this federal civilian interconnection issue. But you know, for those of you that you know who you have DoD facilities, Park Service, or Coast Guard within your borders, it may be something to start thinking about. Tribal governments is another one. If you don't have relationships with those folks, or if you do, starting to think about how to move forward may be important. Starting to think about multimedia and how that might be deployed and how you would do that. Other forms of data like advanced automatic crash notification are another example of data that might be useful to you in figuring out how to do that. The NG911 Interoperability Oversight Commission is looking specifically at the last 2 items, PSAP Credentialing Authority and Forest Guide. Again, those may be things that ultimately will need to be in place that you may want to consider if you've already got the building blocks in place. Next slide. For those of you that are a little further behind, or, you know, frankly, way behind, understanding your limitations and challenges becomes really important. as I said before, what may really help you is learning from the experiences of others. Okay, you weren't a front runner, but to some extent that may give you an advantage they did not have in terms of what you can learn from their experience. What do you need help with to take full advantage of the opportunity? So far, the things that we have heard repeatedly from state governments are that they need help with procurement guidance, procurement strategies, and grant guidance. I mean, I know that overall the 911 agencies in the U.S. are probably less experienced in terms of dealing with federal grants. And so we're trying to figure out how to make those kinds of things available to you. Next slide. Okay, I've already talked about the tribes and the federally operated PSAPs, some other considerations. And these are things that, frankly, the program can't do anything about, but we think about in terms of, the what ifs. If you are part of a state or local government that is currently diverting funds, the question is, if there is another round of grants, who can help bring that issue to the attention of the people who need to be involved to change that diversion status? Again, being a federal agency, we would not be involved in that, but understanding who would actually make that decision and how to convince them to actively get involved in it may be important to take advantage of the next round of grants. And as we move forward with the with whether it's this version or another version of the grant, there are things that you can do both with the folks on Capitol Hill as well as the folks that are implementing the grants to let them know from a really pragmatic standpoint what your concerns and what your ideas are for improving, either the language, the statutory language, or the regulations as they are developed, if they are required for another round of grants. It would be helpful if that input had objective information rather than opinion. It's not that your opinions aren't valuable, it's just that, we have limited application for them in terms of justifying a change. Frankly, think about things in the broadest terms available. Perhaps there are items that were not included in the current round of grants as eligible. Maybe they could be. If if the statute allows it, it's something to think about. Next slide. So, it all comes down to this, one idea, which is why we decided to dedicate half of today's webinar to this topic. If something happens with the proposed legislation, it is a lot of money. We may only get one shot, and we'd want to be able to take full advantage of that opportunity. So those are the ideas that we have. If there's something that the program can do to help you, I think the next slide just shows as many resources as we could get our hands on that may be useful to you. And I think these slides will be made available to you. Whatever we can do to help you, I believe the next slide, my contact information is also available. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry and Sheila for questions.
Thank you, Laurie. Yes, so as a reminder, everyone's phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode. And so if you want to ask a question, you can either use the GoToWebinar question feature, which several of you have done, or you can use the raise hand feature, and we will unmute your phone line and call upon you to ask your question. So Sheila, do you want to go ahead with the first question that we have?
Sure, thank you, Sherry. First question is asking, are additional federal dollars expected?
Well, I think the way that I've chosen to answer that question is nobody knows. I mean, even the people who know don't know. There, as many of you know, there is legislation that is being considered, it's being drafted. How far that gets through the process, I don't think anybody could tell you at this point.
Thank you. Is there an estimated timeline of when the next round of grants may be available?
Well, there you go. As I said, I really, that would be dependent upon what is in the statute, at which point, when and if such a statute is passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the President. So a lot of steps to go before we get there. But the timeline would be established either by the statute or by the regulations. So I would advise, people to pay attention to that. And if it's something that you would like to weigh in on, to please do that.
Great advice. Thank you, Laurie. Is there anything the general public can do to support efforts?
Well, I'm looking at this screenshot of 911.gov. For those of you that may not be aware, there are a series of publications on that site called NG911. There's one for law enforcement, one for fire, one for EMS. There's now one for telecommunicators. If you're looking for folks to help advocate for the 911 system, certainly the end users of the information that we collect, like law enforcement, fire, and EMS, can be instrumental. And I know a lot of folks have used those publications to help rally the troops, because they're written in a way that it sort of enumerates the specific benefits of NG911 for each one of those disciplines. And they are written by that audience, for that audience, in completely non-technical terms. In terms of the general public, there is a lot of information out there, not only on our website, but others like NINA and APCO's that talk about sort of what advantages NG has. We even have a video on N911.gov that explains in very non-technical terms, in about 3 minutes, what NG911 does that the current system does not. So, there are things available to you to rally the troops if that is something that you're interested in.
Thank you. A popular subject these days, the American Rescue Plan. Are you aware of any state or local governments using American Rescue Plan funds to support NG911?
I'm not aware of any. I'm not sure that means that there isn't one, but I'm not aware of any at this point.
Thank you. And can you remind the callers listening in today, what is the build number they need to be watching for?
I apologize. I don't have the bill number on the front of my brain, but I believe it's referred to as the Lift America Act. And again, we are precluded from weighing in on that unless we are specifically requested to provide technical assistance. But for those of you who are interested, I believe that is the name of the bill.
And our last question for this portion of the webinar, is there a contact list we can be added to in order to receive updates of the availability of this funding? There isn't a general contact list through the National 911 program, but generally, and again, it depends on what is in the, what ends up being in the statute. If one is passed, it would probably behoove you to keep in touch with your state 911 agency, because they generally are very aware of what's going on with this, and maybe through NINA, through NASNA, through APCO, whatever channels you have currently available to you. Those folks are keeping track of what's going on very closely and have been directly involved.
Thanks. And Laurie, just as an FYI, someone has, actually a couple of people have put into our question window that it is HR 1848, which is the Lift America Act. And
Thank you.
they did, sure. And they did also provide the web link. So we will make sure that we include that web link when we post the presentation as well as the slide deck after today's webinar.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you, Laurie. Great information, and we had great questions from our audience. So with that, Laurie, I am going to turn it over to you and let you introduce our next speaker, Mr. Ed Reuter.
Thank you so much. So when we were putting together this webinar, there was one state that, you know, sort of stood out among all of the states because, you know, frankly, the amount of legwork that they did in advance of the current round of grants was really impressive. They have been able to hit the ground running as a result of all of the work that they did to prepare. And so we asked Ed Reuter to talk about that experience. Ed is the Executive Director of Indiana Statewide 911 Board, and Ed is here today to sort of share what Indiana did to prepare for the current round of grants. So Ed, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurie, and good afternoon, everyone, and glad to be here. And like Laurie said, I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Statewide 911 Board, and I've served in this capacity for about 4.5 years. But I actually started my public safety career many, many years ago, and I won't go into how long ago that was, as a police dispatcher, and did that for about 3 years before spending 30+ years in law enforcement. And then after that tour, I then was appointed as a 911 director for about 10 years, and then joined the statewide 911 board. We have a very small staff. I have Laurel Simmemeyer, who's a deputy director, who was a 911 director for over 20 years and has been with the statewide 911 board for 10 years. And then I have Teresa Russell as the program manager and executive assistant, and she has about 3 years plus with us, and she came to the office without any 911 experience. However, what she did bring with her 17 years of experience of working in a nonprofit is she has the ability to multitask at a high level and has strong organizational skills. Our staff may be small and requires us to wear many, many hats to accomplish the mission, but we surround ourselves with so many good people that provide tremendous support to our team. This grant project has been a total team effort. And again, Laurie, thank you for inviting Indiana to share our federal grant experience today, and we hope that some of you will find this information beneficial. The next slide, please. Today, and you heard Laurie speak just a little bit ago, what Budge is doing in California, and this is going to be somewhat of a theme and really a process. We really developed ours a little differently. We had what we call pre-planning. We knew as a small team that we had to get some things in place because we had to start thinking about what was going to happen, and I'm going to walk you through that a little bit later. Our administration process is how can we make this process easier for us as well as our sub-recipients. And then the communications. I can't express enough about the communications, not just emails, but then also in person, on the phone, whatever it takes to build trust between you and the people you're working with. And then of course, implementation and evaluation. And going back to the pre-planning today, just take today, for example, what Laurie just did with the pre-planning, the ideas that she's planted out to all of us already here today to start thinking about it, what's ahead of us. The next slide, please. I couldn't begin to tell everything that was done through this grant process, but I do want to give you a high-level overview of the milestones that we've accomplished over these as we talk about the 5 elements that I just mentioned. And our pre-plan actually began when our staff first learned about the federal grant, just as we learned about what Laurie was telling us today. And we had many, many internal discussions that led up to the first planning session as we determined what was Indiana's main objective and what did we really want to accomplish and what would be could create the most significant impact for 911 services in our state. We started sharing ideas about how we could make the grant process less complicated and less intimidating through the paperwork. As you see, in August of 2018, we officially kicked off our pre-planning stage of the program with our consultants. But it started long before that, actually, because we talked with many sheriffs, directors, local officials, and talk about this process and how it may assist them and to upgrade their systems. You see, in September of 2018, we asked for input from the 911 directors and what was their greatest need. We shared this information at our annual Director Summit. The directors were also asked to complete a survey monkey to say what is their greatest need, what are their priorities, and from that we came up with CPE, GIS, CAD, and SIP recorders. We also developed a sub-grant application to make it very basic, to capture the essential information we needed to send up to the federal office. And then one of the things that we developed and also sent in September of 2018, remembering when the grant actually opened, we sent a modified letter that we actually had to fill out to send to the feds to the local level, asking if they would want to participate in this grant program, required a signature to be put on their official letterhead, and let us know that they want to do this. To get that in place, get those conversations going well before the grant even opened up. We took a risk at that, but we still felt confident that it was going to happen, but we didn't know when. But we just, like I said, wanted those elected officials to have enough time to get on board, to start talking about, and to get that planning ahead of time. This letter of intent drew a lot of attention, as you can imagine, and a lot of questions started pouring in. So immediately right there, it fell right into October. We then sent out the list of priorities, what the eligible expenses were going to be, to allow them to take a little more time to evaluate in their PSAPs what they needed, and also to not stress about, and told them, and we stressed not to sign any contracts, not to do anything, but if they wanted to go out and get some quotes to see what those would be, there would be nothing wrong with that. But we didn't want anything signed or anything of that nature. But what we identified early on in our pre-planning is that we were going to have sub-recipients. We were going to use as much money as we could out into the field to help support the PSAPs, because we know that there was a lot of questions throughout the years that when or if there is ever going to be any federal grant money available so that we can do some upgrades. And so that's what we decided to do here in Indiana. As you see, in February of 2019, the federal grant opened up and we finalized the grant applications and they were sent out to the directors, and we gave them a March 1 due date. And because of the pre-planning actions that were taken ahead of time, the applications were completed and returned to our office within 2 to 3 weeks. Then all of these applications were screened by our technical committee, and consisting of consultants and the IN911 staff. And we had just about 3 of those that didn't qualify. We kicked back and we had them, we were able to reallocate some money. And then in March of 2019, after our review, the grant applications were then submitted to the federal office. At this time, the potential sub-recipients were sent a preliminary letter from us of the status of their application, again, communications, and that it was contingent upon their final approval when it was going to be approved. And they were instructed not to start their projects until the final approval was determined. So then in August of 2019, as you see, our office received notification for the approved grant applications, and there were 3 projects that were not approved, and additional adjustments were made, and we adjusted our spending plan to again address and take on some more projects. The sub-recipients were then notified that they could begin their projects. The next slide, please. In October of 2019, the instructions for the reimbursements were then shared with the sub-recipients. But then in December of 2019, things started to really ramp up for us. You know, we updated the reimbursement paperwork to simplify the process for sub-recipients. We looked at the federal paperwork, and nothing that was really wrong with it. It was just the fact that we thought it might be a little intimidating, and talking with our accountant, what is the simple basic information that we needed. And so we developed a basic form with that, and we collected the time period from which the money was spent, when the federal grant award was, what the federal grant award for reimbursement, what that amount is, the county or city match, what they were going to pay, and then what the total. Really, really basic. And then our staff then gleaned that information, transposed it into the federal form, and it made it much easier to read and not get it convoluted into other areas. We also developed a web page, www.in911.net, which was developed, which included instructions and information they needed to file for reimbursement. We also held our first quarterly structured call. We felt another way of communications. We had structured calls set up, every quarter, and where we reviewed paperwork, processed and answered questions. These were set up about every 2 weeks before the end of every quarter, again, to allow them to call in as many times as they needed to ask questions, to make it seem as easy as possible for them and less stressful. And then you see in February of 2020, the first reimbursement check was issued to Du Bois County, Indiana, in southern Indiana for a GIS project. Our original plan was we were going to deliver those checks in person. We thought that would be a way to reach out, contact the auditors, the clerks, the council people, the directors, and deliver those checks. And you can see in that picture, there's Teresa there on the left. Right next to her is Laurel, and then myself and the commissioners and council folks. And it was just a $19,000 check. And you think just $19,000, that's a lot of money for a small county to have a GIS project. But then all of a sudden, when COVID-19 hit, it really changed everything for us. The PSAP directors restricted outsiders from coming into their centers. Technicians were only entering for emergency situations. But then one concern that we had was that some subrecipients were concerned that whether they would even follow through with their projects to come up with 100% needed. We continue to maintain open line communication with them and to keep abreast of how things were going in those areas, and we've been able to work through, and we will have all of those projects completed by March of 2022. And obviously, once COVID hit, all the payments then were all paid by ACH. But one of the things that you see here on March 31 of 2021, from the very beginning of this grant process, we communicated to the subrecipients that we would be checking in, and if we had not heard from them for this period of time, and it's seeing if they were still planning to use their federal funds. What we did find, for an example, we had a newly appointed director in a county who was totally unaware that his county had been awarded a federal grant until we made him aware of that, and they are going to have enough time to complete that project. Otherwise, it could have gone beyond by the wayside, and he would have been totally unaware that they'd even been awarded. We had another agency that was considering reducing its cost with their CAD project by consolidating services with another agency. And again, when that happened, we continued to reevaluate the funds that we had, the available funds that we could still use and not be able to not have to turn any money back into the grant program. And we were able to open it up for just GIS projects, and we were able to add 7 additional GIS projects on the original applications that we sent in. The next slide. Administration. Here again, this is something that what we did, and we took a lot of time in when we developed the applications, the funding priorities, the letter of intent, the reporting form that I talked to you about. We also developed another letter of which is a certificate of completion, that project was completed as awarded. Learned from the previous grant that an agency took the money that they had and actually applied it to another project, and the office was totally unaware that they even did this until the project was done. So we added that step in there. We put the web page in there. And then one thing that's not listed on here is a digital file later on was created for each of the specific agencies, which included their applications, their letters, their photos, inventory list, and everything that was related to that agency was in that file, which gave us a quick reference. The next slide, please. Communications. Laurie, in her most discreet way, and I remember seeing her many, many times at our NASDAQ conferences, and she'd been planting seeds for some time. Never once would she ever hint at when this was going to occur, but I knew that if Laurie said it and was talking about it, this was going to happen, and it was true. So Laurie, I put a lot of faith in you on that, and that's what we took. We know we took that same approach, and we took some risk here, but it paid off, because we had a lot of things in place before the grant even opened up to be able to send those applications out and to have them all their information together and submit those to us within 2 to 3 weeks was an extremely fast time to get that accomplished. But also, in over 18-month period, our staff visited 70 of 121 PSAPs to discuss various topics. The federal grant was one of those. And we spent a lot of time talking to sheriffs, PSAP directors about their needs and how the grant like this could help their agencies, especially the smaller ones. The annual Director Summit, we talked to over 150 directors and communicated this information about the federal grant and just having limited information, but it was going to happen. We solicited information from them. We wanted it to be driven by them. This is what their needs. It wasn't the state trying to push something down onto them. It's what they needed the most. And then we conducted the quarterly conference calls that we talked about. The next slide, please. This is our webpage that was put together that provides a lot of information, and it was available to them that is an easy resource. It talks about the grant reimbursement guidelines. We also had the submission deadlines on there, and as you see on that page, you see the quarterly conference calls in 2020 and also 2021. Directors could call in to as many of those calls as they wanted or as they needed, or they could also call us directly. So that information was readily available for them. We found that very useful. The next slide, please. The next slide, you see the instructions on what's required paperwork that they need for the reimbursement process. So that would, again, not only what we talked about over and over and over, it was right there in print that they could see and use as a reference. The forms, as you see on the right-hand side there, they could download those forms, complete the forms, and then if they had any questions, they could contact us directly. Now, we've created a lot of other things here internally in our office, and we offer that to you if you have questions about any of the letters or any things that we've sent. You know, we are willing to share those with you. All you have to do is just send us an email. We'd be glad to do that. And then the next slide. On the next slide, again, the major March 31 deadline, you know, this would, in 2021, that we would follow up with these agencies, that we would have one more year to reallocate money, and we did that, and we were able to come up with 7 additional projects. And the other thing we talked about is the funding, as you see at the bottom, that they could use the 911 funds that we provide them, which was about 40%. But that money, if they used it to pay for their 100%, had to be reallocated back into their 911 fund once it was reimbursed back from the feds, because some didn't have enough of the local money to take care of that. The next slide, please. Lessons learned. Boy, did we learn a lot of lessons, and we're still learning a lot of lessons here. You know, we underwent a desk audit, as Laurie mentioned, and I will tell you, it was probably some of the best training that anyone could even ask for about learning about federal grants. You know, the procurement requirements and contract. You know, we're a home rule state, and we can't force counties and local agencies to do certain things, but we could have helped guided them along the way to ensure that they're following their policies and procedures. You know, when we asked for a copy of their contracts, that they were signed by both parties, and that would have been better for us to have this more on the front end versus the back end of it. But it was something that we learned about. Rounding of numbers. At first we thought, well, we're going to make this easy. We're just going to round it off to the nearest number and make it pretty simple, but that was not the case. That was corrected to be the exact. You see award letters, preliminary letters versus final letters. On the preliminary letters, once we reviewed the applications at our level and sent those to the federal office, we notified the agencies with a preliminary letter of the status of their project. When we received final approval, we initially started just sending them emails without a final letter. We soon found out it was much easier and more official to just develop a final letter to give them notification, because of the auditors. You know, the directors were okay with this. The auditors were looking for a final letter with a little more specific information, which we took care of. And then also, another thing is to check the contracts to ensure that the projects do not extend past the performance period or at least the agreement services. Very, very important. And then the last thing that we have listed here is to simplify it. Be willing to be flexible and don't be afraid to change it to make it work. Don't fight yourself through the program. You know, keep it simple as possible. And our next slide. This map shows the impact of what $2.8 million of federal money has done for the state of Indiana. 40% added to that equal to $4.6 million in upgrades in our state. Nearly 40% of the Indiana counties will benefit with 44 projects by March of 2022. You see in the red counties, those are the projects that are completed, and the blue are the ones that are in progress, and the one in purple, they have completed one project and they have one that's in progress. So when you look at that in a statewide, it really, I feel very proud of what we've accomplished here and what we've been able to maximize the funding that's been made available to us, and that we've been able to push it all out to the field where the rubber meets the road. I'm sure that many of you could share even better ideas that have made your project successful. You know, while we often learn through our failures, I think we can learn even more through our successes. And this is why all of us on this call today should, if we know of a state or want to pick up the phone and call each other to talk to each other about your program and how it worked. And I feel that our next step is this, that we're going to take and review and prepare an after action report and find out what worked best and what didn't. And we need to listen to our counterparts about other ideas and suggestions so that the next federal grant process can be even better. And just like I said, we were very pleased that over 99% of our funding has gone out into the field, and we're very pleased where we're at, but we still know we have a lot to learn. So that's all that I have, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take those.
Thank you, Mr. Reuter. We appreciate the information you've shared. And with that, we are going to once again start the next Q&A portion of our session. And just a quick reminder, to ask a question, you can either use the GoToWebinar chat feature or you can use the raise hand button. So with that, Sheila, do you want to move forward with our first question?
Yes, thank you, Sherry. Can you give some examples of the GIS projects that were funded?
Well, the GIS platforms in Indiana are governed by the local agencies, and where, for example, WTH is big in the state of Indiana, is one of the main vendors that knew that they needed to upgrade their GIS platform, their center lines, their boundaries, their shape files. A lot of those needed work, address points. So they've been working with them and getting those up to speed to get them to where they can be I3 compliant.
What role did the State Geographic Information Officer play? And did Indiana have a centralized GIS data repository?
Indiana does not have a central GIS repository. One of our communication service providers has that, and has built that platform for call delivery. We deliver the calls and then to the boundaries of the PSAPs, and then from that point on, it's governed by the local levels to do the call assignments through their CAD systems. We've communicated with our state GIS. This is something that you know, we would definitely be looking forward in the future of working to build the state side of this, but and we work with her on some ideas on some of the counties that have been struggling. I know she does a great job on her end, and we do communicate, but we don't control that from the state 911 board. That under state statute, we do not govern that with that process.
So thinking about prioritizing the projects, what criteria did you use? Was it based on readiness for implementation, for greatest population impacted? What did you use for criteria?
Well, we received the feedback through our Survey Monkey that we sent out to the directors and communicated with them. They know that because we were pushing the money out to the PSAPs to upgrade their systems, some of them may have already had an updated CAD system, some may have already had an updated GIS system. What was their greatest need at the local level? And what we did, all of those that were identified are eligible expenses through our 911 funds here in the state of Indiana. And so we allowed them at the local level to kind of make that decision on where their need was, but then we also brought those down into the top 3 or 4 main items, what we felt that we wanted to stay focused with, and that's what we came up with.
For this grant or for any potential future grants, do you expect the need to staff up to handle some administrative functions of the grant? And if you did, or if you do, what process did you use or would you anticipate using? Hiring, contractors, outsourcing?
Well, first of all, we relied heavily on our consultants who have had grant experience. We're very fortunate here in Indiana that we have the ladies that work for me do a remarkable job, and I will tell you that we pushed them to the limit. We pushed all of us to the limit, and I could see this task here being a one-person job just to focus on, because being a small staff, like I said, we had to wear many hats here, and that's why we had to pre-plan and get things ahead when we had downtime, is to plan and not wait till the last minute. So yes, I could see us moving forward to looking at bringing on some additional help on a grant, depending on the size and all that goes with this. So yeah, I don't want to overwork them too much, because I can tell you, if I didn't have the ladies that are working for me today, this grant program would not be the success that it is.
Our last question for today's webinar is for both of our presenters. What are the top 3 obstacles you have seen that are preventing centers from being able to migrate to NG911 capabilities?
Well, I can start out with it. What we are very close here in Indiana actually to migrating. We were building 2 ESINETs with 2 separate vendors, and we are scheduled to have it completed by the end of June. However, because of the incompatibility of certain CPE to the next generation network, we have run into some hurdles and some obstacles. That is being worked through, and it is being programmed. But I think what we need to consider on our end is to not dictate what CPE they need to purchase, or the call handling equipment that they need to purchase. But we do need to set the parameters and say, here are the ones that can qualify and that will actually do the work. And here are some that are not at the level that they need to be. So that's what's held us up on actually one county, actually 2 counties that we're holding up on, but those should all be worked through by the end of this month.
And I'll add to that. I think in some cases, it's frankly more of a people thing than a technology thing. Trying to figure out who all the right people are that need to be communicating with each other on an ongoing basis is really important. And depending on what the project is, as I said before, that may involve people other than within the 911 agency itself. So identifying those folks, figuring out what that process is going to be, figuring out what the rules of the game are, frankly. I mean, it all takes time. And so to the extent that those things can be addressed ahead of time, I think that will be really helpful to folks, because trying to get people together on the same page to agree on the path forward it really held up a lot of folks. So whatever you can do in advance, and part of the reason why we're doing this webinar is to start thinking about things like that.
And I did want to add one other thing too that I failed to mention, is that the cooperation that we have had from Laurie and Yuki's office throughout this process, and the accessibility that our office has had to work us through from the very beginning. And we try to do be the same for the locals from our level, that the federal offices were so supportive of the state, and we felt we needed to be in the same for the counties and the cities. And without their help and support, and ability to answer these questions for us, we would be struggling. We would be. And we still have a lot of lessons to learn, but thank you, Laurie and Yuki and all of your staffs for the work that you've done to help us.
Well, thank you, Ed. You know, I think it's clear why we asked Ed and the folks from Indiana to present today. Thank you to you and your staff, because you guys did a bang-up job.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to add on to all the thanks and say thanks again to both of you, Ed and Laurie, for presenting today. With that, this concludes today's webinar. We appreciate everyone's participation. As a reminder, an archived version of today's webinar will be available on 911.gov soon. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, September 14th, 2021 at noon Eastern Time. We hope that everyone is able to join us. And with that, I'd like to thank you and say have a great rest of your Tuesday.